You know the drill. Proust. What was also special about Saturday was that on this day, during the month of May, we would go out after dinner to attend the month of Mary. Since there we would sometimes meet Monsieur Vintuel, who was very severe about the deplorable fashion of slovenliness in young people, which seemed to be encouraged these days. My mother would take care that nothing was wrong with my appearance, then we would leave for church. It was the month of May that I remember beginning to be fond of the hawthorns. Not only were they in the church, which was so holy, but which we had the right to enter. They were put up on the altar itself, inseparable from the mysteries in which whose celebration they took part, their branches running out among the candles and holy vessels, attached horizontally to one another in a festive preparation, and made even lovelier by the festoons of their foliage, on which were scattered in profusion, as on a bridal train, little bunches of buds of a dazzling whiteness. But though I dared not to do more than steal a glance at them, I felt that the ceremonious preparations were alive, and that it was nature herself who, carving these indentations in the leaves by adding the superior ornament of those white buds, had made the decorations worthy of what was at once a popular festivity and mystical celebration. Higher up, their corollas, opening here and there with a careless grace, still holding so casually like a last vaporous adornment the bouquets of stamens, delicate as gossamer, which clouded them entirely, that in following and trying to mine deeper inside myself the motions of their flowering, I imagined it as the quick and thoughtless movements of the head, with coquettish glance and contracted eyes, of a young girl in white, dreamy and alive. Monsieur Vintuel had come in with his daughter and sat down beside us. He was from a good family and had been my grandmother's sister's piano teacher, and when, after his wife died, he came into an inheritance, he retired near Combray. We often entertained him at the house. But he was extremely prudish, and stopped coming so as not to meet Swann, who had made what he called an unsuitable marriage, as is the fashion these days. My mother, after learning that he composed, had said to him in a friendly way that she went to see him. That when she went to see him, he would have to let her hear something of his. Monsieur Vintuel would take great pleasure in this, but he was so scrupulous in his politeness and kindness that, always putting himself in the place of others, he was afraid he would bore them and appear egotistical if he pursued or even allowed them to infer his own desires. The day my parents had gone to visit him at his home, I had gone with them, but they had allowed me to stay outside, and since Monsieur Vintuel's house, Montejouvain, stood at the foot of a brush-covered hillock, where I had hidden, I found I was on a level with the second-floor drawing-room, a foot or two from the window. When the servant had come to announce my parents, I had seen Monsieur Vintuel hurry to place a piece of music in a conspicuous position on the piano, but once my parents had entered, he had taken it away and put it in a corner. No doubt he had been afraid of letting them think he was happy to see them, only so that he could play them some of his compositions. And each time my mother made a fresh attempt in the course of the visit, he had repeated several times, "I don't know who put that on the piano, it doesn't belong there," and had diverted the conversation to other subjects precisely because they interested him less. His only passion was for his daughter, and she, with her boy's appearance, seemed so robust that one could not help smiling at the sight of the precautions her father took for her sake, always having extra shawls to throw over her shoulders. My grandmother pointed out what gentle and delicate, almost shy expression came into the eyes of that rough-mannered child whose face was covered with freckles. After she made a remark, she would hear it in the minds of the people to whom she had made it, and would grow alarmed as possible misunderstandings. And one would see, illuminated, showing through as though by transparency, under the mannish face of the good fellow that she was, the more refined features of a young girl in tears. When, before leaving the church, I knelt in front of the altar, I suddenly smelled, as I stood up, a bittersweet scent of almonds escaping from the hawthorns. And then I noticed on the flowers little yellow places under which I imagined the scent must be hidden. As the taste of a frangipani must be hidden under the burned parts, or that of Mademoiselle Vintuel's cheeks under her freckles. Despite the silence and stillness of the hawthorns, the intermittent scent was like the murmuring of an intense life with which the altar quivered, like a country hedge visited by a living antenna, of which I was reminded by the sight of certain stamens, almost russet red, that seemed to have preserved the springtime virulence, the irritant power of insects now metamorphosed into flowers. We would talk of Monsieur Vintuel for a moment in front of the porch on our way out of the church. He would intervene among the children squabbling in the square, take up the defense of the little ones, deliver a lecture to the older ones. If his daughter said to us in her loud voice how happy she was to see us, it would immediately seem as if a more sensitive sister within her were blushing at this thoughtless, tomboyish remark, which might have made us think she was asking to be invited to our house. Her father would throw a cloak over her shoulders. They would get up into a little cabriolet, which she would drive herself, and the two of them would return to Montjoie-le-Vain. As for us, since it was Sunday, and the next day we would not get up until it was time for high mass, if there was moonlight and the air was warm, instead of having us go home directly, my father, out of love of personal glory, would take us by the way of the Calvary on a long walk, which my mother's little capacity for orienting herself or knowing what road she was on made her consider the feat of strategic genius. Sometimes we would go as far as the viaduct, whose giant strides of stone began at the railway station, represented to me the exile and distress that lay outside the civilized world, because each year as we came from Paris we were warned to carefully pay attention. When Combray came, not to let the station go by, to be ready ahead of time, because the train would leave again after 2 minutes, and would set off across the viaduct beyond the Christian countries, of which Combray marked for me the furthest limit. We would return by way of the station boulevard, which was lined by the most pleasant houses in the parish. In each garden, the moonlight, like Robert, was scattering its broken staircases of white marble, its fountains, its half-open gates. Its light had destroyed the telegraph office. All that remained was one column, half shattered, but still remaining, the beauty of an immortal ruin. I would be dragging my feet. I would be ready to drop with sleep. The fragrance of the lindens that perfumed the air would seem to me a reward that one could only win at the cost of the greatest fatigue. And that was not worth the trouble. From gates far apart, dogs awakened by our solitary steps would send forth alternating volleys of barks, such as I still hear at times in the evening, and among which the station boulevard, when the public garden of Combray was created on its site, must have come to take refuge, for wherever I find myself, as soon as they begin resounding and replying, I see it again, with its lindens and its pavements lit by the moon. Suddenly my father would stop us and ask my mother, "Where are we?" Exhausted from walking, but proud of him, she would admit tenderly that she had absolutely no idea. He would shrug his shoulders and laugh. Then, as if he had taken out of his jacket pocket, along with his key, he would show us the little back gate of our own garden which stood there before us. Having come along the corner of the Rue de Saint-Esprit to wait for us at the end of these unfamiliar streets, my mother would say to him, admiringly, "You are astonishing," and from that moment on I would not have to take another step. The ground would walk for me through that garden, where for so long now my actions had ceased to be accompanied by any deliberate attention. Habit had taken me in its arms and carried me all the way to my bed like a child. If Saturday, which began an hour earlier and deprived her of Francois, passed more slowly than other days for my aunt, she nonetheless awaited its return with impatience from the beginning of the week, because it contained all the novelty and distraction that her weakened and finical body was still able to endure. And yet this was not to say that she did not now and then aspire to some greater change, that she did not experience those exceptional moments when we thirst for something other than we have, and when people who from a lack of energy or imagination cannot find a source of renewal in themselves, ask the next minutes that come the postman as he rings to bring them something new, even if it is something worse, some emotion, some sorrow, when our sensibility, which happiness has silenced like an idle harp, wants to resonate under some hand, even a rough one, and even if it might be broken by it, when the will, which has with such difficulty won the right to surrender unimpeded to its own desires, to its own afflictions, would like to throw the reins into the hands of imperious events, even if they may be cruel. Doubtless, since my aunt's strength, drained by the least fatigue, returned to her only drop by drop deep within her repose, the reservoir was very slow to fill up, and months would go by before she had that slight overflow which others divert into activity, and which she was incapable of knowing and deciding how to use. I have no doubt that then, just as the desire to replace them by potatoes with bechamel sauce ended after a certain time by being born from the very pleasure she felt at the daily return of mashed potatoes of which she never got tired, she would derive from the accumulation of these monotonous days, which she valued so, the expectation of some domestic cataclysm, lasting only a moment, but forcing her to effect once and for all one of those changes which she recognized would be beneficial to her, and to which she could not of her own accord make up her mind. She truly loved us. She would have taken pleasure in mourning us, had it come at a moment when she felt well and was not in a sweat. The news that the house was being consumed by a fire in which all of us had perished already, and would soon leave not a single stone of the wall standing, but from which she would have ample time to escape without hurrying, so long as she got out of bed right away, must often have lingered among her hopes, since it combined with a secondary advantage, of allowing her to save all her tenderness for us in an extended grief, and to be the cause of stupefaction in the village as she led the funeral procession, courageous and stricken, dying on her feet. That other more precious advantage of forcing her at the right moment, with no time to lose, no possibility of an enervating hesitation, to go and spend the summer on her pretty farm, Merlegrain, where there was a waterfall. As no event of that sort had ever occurred, the outcome of which she would certainly contemplate when she was alone, absorbed in her innumerable games of patience, and which would have reduced her to despair at the first moment of its realization, at the first of those little unforeseen developments, the first word announcing the bad news, whose accent can never be forgotten afterwards, all those things that bear the imprint of real death, so different from its logical, abstract possibility. She would, from time to time, resort to introducing into her life, to make it more interesting, imaginary incidents which she would follow with passion. She enjoyed suddenly pretending that Francois was stealing from her, that she herself had been cunning enough to make sure of it, that she had caught her in the act, being in the habit, when she played cards alone, of playing both her own hand and that of her opponent. She would utter out loud to herself Francois's embarrassed excuses, and would answer them with so much fire and indignation that if one of us entered at that moment, we would find her bathed in perspiration, her eyes sparkling, her false hair dislodged and revealing her bald forehead. Francois would perhaps sometimes hear from the next room mordant pieces of sarcasm addressed to her, the invitation of which would not have relieved my aunt sufficiently if they had remained in a purely immaterial state, and if by murmuring them half aloud she had not given them any more reality. Sometimes even this theatre in bed was not enough for my aunt. Or staircase. Wit. She wanted to have her play performed. And so on a Sunday, all doors mysteriously closed, she would confide to Eulalie her doubts about Francois' honesty, her intention of getting rid of her, and at another time to Francois her suspicions of the faithlessness of Eulalie, to whom the door would very soon be closed. And a few days later, she would be disgusted with her confidant of the day before, and once again consort with a traitor. Though for the next performance the two of them would exchange roles yet again. But the suspicions that Eulalie was at times able to inspire in her amounted only to a straw fire and died down quickly for lack of fuel, since Eulalie did not live in the house. It was not the same for those that concerned Francois, of whose presence under the same roof my aunt was perpetually conscious, though for fear of catching cold if she left her bed, she did not dare go down into the kitchen to verify whether they were well founded. Gradually her mind would come to be occupied entirely by attempting to guess what, at each moment, Francois could be doing in trying to hide for her. She would notice the most furtive movements of Francois' features, a contradiction in something she said, a desire that she seemed to be concealing. She would show Francois that she had unmasked her with a single word that would make Francois turn pale, and that my aunt seemed to find a cruel amusement in driving deep into the heart of the unfortunate woman. And the following Sunday, a revelation of Eulalie's, like those discoveries that suddenly open an unsuspected field to a young science that has gone into something of a rut, would prove to my aunt that her own suppositions were far short of the truth. But Francois ought to know that, now that you've given her a carriage. Given her a carriage, my aunt would cry. Oh, well, I don't know really. I saw her passing just a short time ago in a cloche, proud as Audubon, going to the market in Roussainville. I thought it was Madame Octave who gave it to her. And so, by degrees, Francois and my aunt, like quarry and hunter, would reach the point of constantly trying to appreciate each other's ruses. My aunt was afraid Francois would develop a real hatred for. My mother was afraid that Francois would develop a real hatred for my aunt, who insulted her as brutally as she could. Certainly, Francois came more and more to pay extraordinary attention to the least of my aunt's remarks, to the least of her gestures. When she had to ask her something, she would hesitate for a long time over how she should go about it. And when she had tendered her request, she would observe my aunt carefully, covertly, trying to guess from the look on her face what she thought and what she would decide. And so, while some artist who reads the memoir of the 17th century and wants to be like the great king and thinks he will be making progress in that direction if he fabricates a genealogy for himself that traces his own descent from a historic family, or if he carries on a correspondence with one of the current sovereigns of Europe, it is actually turning his back on what he mistakenly sought in forms that were identical and consequently dead. An old lady from the provinces who was simply yielding to irresistible manias and to the malice born of idleness, saw, without ever thinking of Louis XIV, the most insignificant occupations of her day, those concerned with her rising, her lunch, her afternoon rest, the choir, because of their despotic singularity. Some of the interest of what Saint-Simon called the mechanics of life at Versailles, and could also believe that her silences, a nuance of good humor or disdain in her features, were for Francois the object of a commentary as passion, as fearful as they were silent. As fearful as were the silence, the good humor, the disdain of the king, when a courtier, or even his greatest lords, handed him a petition at the bend of the avenue of Versailles. One Sunday, when my aunt had had a visit from the cure and Eulalie at the same time, and had rested afterward, we all went up to say good evening to her, and Maman offered her condolences on the bad luck that always brought her visitors at the same hour. I know that things turned out poorly again this afternoon, Leonie, she said to her gently. You had all your company here at the same time. Which my great aunt interpreted with, too much of a good thing can do no harm, because her daughter had become ill. Ever since her daughter had become ill, she had believed it was her duty to cheer her up by consistently showing her the bright side of everything. But now my father spoke. I would like to take advantage, he said, of the fact that the whole family is together to tell you all about something without having to begin all over with each of you separately. I'm afraid we've had a falling out with Le Grandin. He barely said hello to me this morning. I did not stay to hear my father's story, because I had actually been with him after Mass when we met Monsieur Le Grandin, and I went to the kitchen to ask about the menu for our dinner, which diverted me every day, like the news in the paper, and excited me like the program for some festivity. When Monsieur de Grandin had passed us near as he was coming from out of the church, walking by the side of a lady from a neighboring chateau whom we knew only by sight, my father had greeted him in a way that was at once friendly and reserved, though we had not stopped. Monsieur de Grandin had barely responded, with a surprised look as if he did not recognize us, and with that perspective in his gaze peculiar to people who do not want to be friendly, and who, from the suddenly extended depths of their eyes, seemed to perceive you at the end of an interminable road, and at so great a distance that they confine themselves to addressing you as a minuscule nod in order to give it the proportions of your puppet-like dimensions. Now, the Lady Le Grandin was a virtuous and esteemed person. It was quite out of the question that he was having an affair, and embarrassed at being found out. And my father wondered how he might have annoyed Le Grandin. I would be especially sorry to know if he is vexed, said my father, because of the fact that among all these people dressed up in their Sunday best, there is something about him with his little straight jacket, his loose tie, that is so uncontrived, so truly simple, an air of ingenuousness, almost, that is extremely likable. But the family council was unanimously of the opinion that my father was imagining things, or that Le Grandin at that particular moment was absorbed in some other thought. And in fact, my father's apprehension was dispelled the very next morning. As we were returning from a long walk near the Point Vieux, we saw Le Grandin, who, because of the holidays, was staying in Combray for a few days. He came up to us with hand outstretched. "My young bookworm," he said. He asked me, "Do you know this line by Paul Desjardins? The woods are dark, the sky still blue." Isn't that a fine rendering of this hour of the day? Perhaps you've never read Paul Desjardins. Read him, my child. Today he is transforming himself, they tell me, into a sermonizing frere. But for a long time he was a limpid watercolorist. The woods are dark, the sky still blue. May the sky remain forever blue for you, my young friend, and even at the hour which is now approaching for me, when the woods are dark already, when the night is falling fast, you will console yourself as I do by looking up at the sky. He took out a cigarette from his pocket, remained for a long time with his eyes on the horizon. "Goodbye, friends," he said suddenly, and left us. At the hour when I usually went downstairs to find out what the menu was, dinner would have already been started, and Francois, commanding the forces of nature, which were now her assistants, as in fairy plays, where giants hire themselves out as cooks, would strike the coal, entrust the steam with some potatoes to cook, and make the fire finish to perfection the culinary masterpieces first prepared in potter's vessels that ranged from great vats, casseroles, cauldrons, and fish kettles, to tureens for game, moulds for pastry, and little jugs for cream, and included a complete collection of pans of every shape and size. I would stop by the table where the kitchen maid had just shelled them to see the little peas lined up and tallied like green marbles in a game. But what delighted me were the asparagus, steamed in ultramarine and pink, whose tips, delicately painted with little strokes of mauve and azure, shade off imperceptibly down to their feet, still soiled, though they are from the dirt of their garden bed, with an iridescence that is not of this earth. It seemed to me that these celestial hues revealed the delicious creatures who had merrily metamorphosed themselves into vegetables, and who, through the disguise of their firm, edible flesh, disclosed in these early tints of dawn, in these beginnings of rainbows, in this extinction of blue evenings, the precious essence that I recognized again when all night long, following a dinner at which I had eaten them, they played in farces as crude and poetic as a fairy play by Shakespeare at changing my chamber pot into a jar of perfume. That's where I'm going to end, page 124.